wanted to keep the supermodel thing a secret. Banana bread, kind of true. Yeah, great, right on the spot. Thank you so much, first to Bethany, for working with me to make sure that I got here and everything went smoothly. And it's just always so great to be in New England and to to have a chance to share this book project with so many people. I'll tell you, the crowds in New England, wherever I go, man, you know how to welcome someone. So I thank you for that in advance. And today what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about how I came to this project. I'll give you some context. And I'll also read a little bit from the book. Hopefully I have enough light to do that. The one thing that has happened over the course of writing this book is that the old eyes have changed a little bit, making reading in these places. I did my first book reading back in February, and I noticed I was sort of doing this action right here, so forgive me if I pause at moments while reading. When I really sort of had no idea that when this book came out, we would be sort of sitting in this specific political moment. Yeah, I sort of thought things would be a little different. And I'll tell you, you know, after the election in November, the sort of book sales part of me was triggered, and I got nervous. And I thought, oh my God, Trump's president, no one's going to care at all about this book, Never Caught. And I couldn't have been so wrong. I think that to have a story, a book about a 22-year-old black woman who defied the president of the United States is sort of right one time. So, here's to actually to good timing. About 20 years ago, I was completing some work on my dissertation, actually, which became my first book. And I was in the archives, and I was spending some time looking at newspapers. That's what historians do, right? You look at newspapers to try to figure out what kind of everyday life was like in the 18th century. And I was sitting at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, looking through old microfilm, and I stumbled across a runaway slave advertisement. And I thought, okay, well, it's not so odd, even though at that point there were very few slaves in Philadelphia, but some people advertised for runaways, not so odd. But then I went and I read further, and I realized that this was a runaway slave advertisement from the house of the President of the United States. And I thought, okay, wait a minute, 1796, that's George Washington, okay. And I went on to read the advertisement, and the ad was for a runaway woman who they called Oni Judge. And I thought, wait a minute, why don't I know this name? Why don't I know this person? Here I am, preparing to be a sort of expert in the field of early African-American women's history, and I had never heard her name, I had never heard the story, and I wondered what happened to her. What happened? Did she get away? Did she stay away? And I sort of vowed to find out what ended up, what happened to Oni Judge. And as you can tell from the cover of the book, I use the name Ona Judge. And sometimes if you know the story, there's sort of a move in between Ona and Oni. Oni is the name that the Washingtons called her. And I argue that it was the diminutive of her name, like My Little Oni. And that I use the name Ona, which is the name she went by at the end of her life, as a sort of marker of adult dignity, that this was the name she chose to go by. And so that's how I refer to her. So you'll see sometimes her referred to as Oni and sometimes Ona. So I vowed to return to her. I said, maybe I'll work her into the first book, and then I said, no, I need to come back to this. And so I finished the first book, came back, and really took the next 9 years of researching and writing to uncover the life of one of the most incredible women I've ever encountered in the archives. So I'll read a bit, I'll give some context, and then we'll have some time for Q&A as well at the end. Spring rain drenched the streets of Philadelphia in 1796. Weather in the city of brotherly love was often fickle at this time of year, vacillating between extreme cold and oppressive heat, but rain was almost always appreciated in the nation's capital. It erased the putrid smells of rotting food, of animal waste, and filth that permeated the cobblestone roads of the new nation. It reminded Philadelphians that the long and punishing winter was behind them. Spring rain cleansed the streets and souls of Philadelphians, ushering in optimism and hope and a feeling of rebirth. And in the midst of the promises of spring, Ona Judge, a young black enslaved woman, received devastating news. She learned that she was to leave Philadelphia, a city that had become her home. Judge was to travel back to the birthplace, her birthplace of Virginia, and to prepare herself to be bequeathed or given away to her owner's granddaughter. Today I'll introduce one of the most understudied fugitive slaves in America. At the age of 22, Judge stole herself from the Washingtons, forcing the president to show his slave-catching hand. As a fugitive, Judge would test the president's will and his reputation. The most important man in the new nation, heralded with winning the American Revolution, could not reclaim his enslaved woman. Ona Judge did what very few people could do. She beat the president. Judge was never caught. So I'll talk a little bit about the title, Never Caught. This was always sort of my working title with the book, and I finished the manuscript and I was ready to turn it in. My editor loved it. And then we took it to marketing, and marketing hated it. They said, "Erica, you're kind of giving away the story here." And I said, well, that didn't hurt 12 years a slave or death of a salesman. Like, you know what's going to happen, right? After 12 years, he's going to be free. And, you know, people die. Like, and so this was more, you know, I had to sort of push and say this is not so much about exactly what happens with this encounter between the Washingtons and Ona. This is more of a story about, as I have up here, the founding of a nation through the eyes of the enslaved. And the reality was that Ona was never free or had freedom, and those were the words they were sort of pushing me, coaxing me to use. The reality was that Ona spent nearly half a century as a fugitive. She was not free. She was simply never caught. But what her experience, her life has allowed me to do in this book is to get at the beginning of the founding of the nation, but to do it through the eyes of an enslaved woman. And so as opposed to the sort of typical narrative through founding fathers or through a sort of top-down approach, I was able and wanted to use Ona's life as a way to explore what this early period when a nation was just being formed, what it looked like, what it felt like, not for the elite, not necessarily for presidents and or first ladies. We don't use that term really until much later, but I use it in the book. I wanted to know what it felt like for the enslaved, what it meant for the fugitives in this country, and what it meant for servants as well. And so Ona's life gives us this perfect portal to study this because she moves in so many locations, to so many locations, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So this is an image of Mount Vernon. It's actually a later image. from 1872, so actually after Ona's life, but it's one of the sort of clearer images. There's some from the 1840s and 50s that are a bit tattered, but I always use this image, especially when I'm teaching to students, because I want them to have an idea of where Ona's life began and what Mount Vernon, the mansion house in particular, looked like. So in this book, I introduce what I call a new American hero, an enslaved girl raised at Mount Vernon who, once exposed to the ideas of freedom, was compelled to pursue it at any cost. This was a woman who found the courage to defy the president, the wit to find allies, to escape, to out-negotiate, to run, and to survive. Her story is the only existing account of a fugitive once held by the Washingtons. So because Ona left behind 2 interviews at the end of her life, it's really the only kind of testimony that we have from others who ran off. We know the stories of Harry Washington and others who ran off during the American Revolution, but she left behind interviews. We also believe that that her account is perhaps the only fugitive account from an enslaved person in 18th century Virginia. Judge's life exposes the sting of slavery and the drive of defiance. She guarded what she called her freedom later on in her life, every day, never regretting her decision to fight for what she believed to be her right, and that was freedom. Ona was born sometime around 1772, 73, the sort of Revolutionary era. We don't have an exact date because Washington did not write down the birth dates of the enslaved. An important thing to note is that technically Ona Judge was not owned by George Washington. She was owned by Martha Washington. So Martha Washington, this is a history moment, right? She was married before George Washington. Her husband died, and eventually she would marry George Washington. But as a widow, she had a tremendous amount of wealth. And much of that wealth sat in the bodies of the enslaved. Ona's mother, Betty, was one of those enslaved people, and she traveled with Martha Washington to Mount Vernon when she married, at that point, Colonel George Washington. So it's interesting when we think about this marriage. George Washington actually, he's the one that sort of comes up financially in this marriage because Martha sort of owns a much more sort of property and has more wealth. Washington had enslaved people as well as some property, but she really was the wealthier of the two. When Betty arrived at Mount Vernon, she brought with her her toddler son, Austin. She was able to do what very few enslaved women could do when they were forced to leave their homes or farms, and that is she was able to bring her child with her. At some point, Betty moved on to become, at Mount Vernon, one of the more sort of talented seamstresses and spinners. And at some moment, in some method or way, she had an encounter with a man named Andrew Judge. And Andrew Judge was a white indentured servant. And Washington had purchased his indenture agreement in Baltimore around in the early 1770s. I don't know if their relationship was consensual. I don't know if it was violent. What I know is that Andrew Judge was a tailor and known for creating some of the most important uniforms worn by George Washington during the Revolution. He was a tailor, Betty was a spinner and a seamstress, and at some point there was a union of some kind, and out of that came Ona Judge. Andrew Judge was the only person with the surname of Judge at Mount Vernon, so all of the Washington's records only have him with that surname. And actually, with my research, there were no other judges in all of Fairfax County. And so the fact that the Washington's name lists Ona as a judge distinguished her. It was a marker that she had parents, she had a father. And the fact that he was a white indentured servant allowed for this marker to take place. At the age of 10, Ona was brought up to the mansion house to learn to sort of follow in her mother's footsteps. She became a seamstress and a spinner, but she worked her way sort of up. There's no sort of better phrase for this, but she basically became Martha Washington's top slave. And she was responsible for the most intimate of responsibilities with Martha Washington. She helped her bathe. She brushed her hair. She helped her with her clothing. So this kind of relationship developed over time. And eventually, Ona lands this top spot as Martha Washington's sort of right hand. And with this, though, came a major change in Ona's life. This is an image of Federal Hall in Wall Street. And this is actually the location where George Washington would eventually take his oath of office and sort of wave to the crowd, have a few words. In 1789, he was elected president. And what was so interesting at this moment, when I was sort of doing the research, was that George Washington actually traveled to New York alone. Martha Washington didn't go. She didn't want to move. I know this story. She felt like he had spent a significant amount of time away during the Revolution. She worried about his health. She actually thought he was sort of too old and had some health issues and shouldn't really become the president. She actually referred to her time in the North as the lost days, her lost days. She was very unhappy about this move. And one of the things, so I'm reading these letters between the secretary, Tobias Lear, and who were trying to coax Martha to hurry up and come to New York, telling her, oh, we have a good cook and good food and you'll love it, and Martha wasn't having it. Eventually, though, of course, she moved to New York, and the Washingtons would take 7 enslaved people from Mount Vernon to New York, 5 men, 2 women, and one of those women was Ona Judge. So the fact that she was Martha Washington's top slave put her in this position that had her move. And I'm going to read a bit from the book about this moment when Ona Judge leaves Mount Vernon for New York. The young Ona Judge was far from an experienced traveler. The teenager knew only Mount Vernon and its surroundings and had never traveled far from her family and loved ones. For Judge, the move must have been similar to the dreaded auction block. Although she was not to be sold to a different owner, she was forced to leave her family for an unfamiliar destination hundreds of miles away. Judge would have no choice but to stifle the terror she felt and to go on about the work of preparing to move, folding linens, packing Martha Washington's dresses and personal accessories, helping with the grandchildren, were all the tasks at hand. And it wasn't her place to complain or question. Judge had to remain strong and steady, if not for herself, then for her mistress, who appeared to be falling apart at the seams. Like Judge, Martha Washington had no choice about the move to New York. Her life was at the direction of her husband, who was now the most powerful man in the country. Mrs. Washington and Ona Judge may have shared similar concerns, but of course only Martha Washington was allowed to express discontent and sorrow. Martha Washington was unhappy, and everyone knew it, including her frightened slave. The president's nephew, Robert Lewis, would also soon be made aware of it. When he arrived at the estate on May 14th, things were in disarray. Lewis, who served as Washington's secretary between 1789 and 91, was chosen to escort his aunt and her grandchildren to New York, but was surprised and a bit concerned when he arrived to find a frenzied and hectic scene. Lewis wrote, quote, everything appeared to be in confusion, end quote. The manifestation of Mrs. Washington's conflicting feelings. Robert Lewis described the departure, which finally took place on May 16, 1789, as an emotional moment for the enslaved and the First Lady. He wrote, quote, "After an early dinner and making all necessary arrangements, in which we were greatly retarded, it brought us to 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we left Mount V. The servants of the house and a number of the field negroes made their appearance to take leave of their mistress. Numbers of these poor wretches seemed greatly agitated, much affected, my aunt equally so. Betty, Ona Judge's mother, must have been one of those agitated slaves. Not only was she losing her 16-year-old daughter, but she was also losing her son, Austin, who would serve as one of the Washington's waiters. Austin's wife, Charlotte, and their children would have joined in the morning. Betty watched her children leave Mount Vernon, a reminder of what little control enslaved mothers had over the lives of their children. If she found any comfort that day, it would have been that brother and sister were traveling together. Austin was older and male and could look out for his younger sister. Still, Betty knew that her relationship with her children would never be the same. And so this is the moment that Ona leaves for New York, and when she arrives in New York, she witnesses a very sort of different environment than Virginia. New York was wrestling with the issue of slavery, and there were still a significant number of enslaved men and women in New York, over 20,000. But there was also a free population of blacks, one that she had never really seen before, not in Virginia. Her stay in New York would be relatively short. This is, the book came out in this moment when, and also as a history professor, I've never had so many students be aware of the early Republic era and had everything to do with Hamilton, right? So they're singing the songs, and they know about how the nation's capital shifts from New York to Philadelphia, and I'm like, hey, you know the history, however you get it, I'm happy for it, thank you. Right? So in many ways, this book sort of came out at a moment where we're thinking more, at least in a popular way, about the founding of the nation. And really, the Washingtons would relocate to Philadelphia in November of 1790, and that was a sort of compromise for 10 years. And Philadelphia would be the next stop on Ona's journey. This is an image of the president's house. It's actually a later lithograph from the 1830s. But I also show this image because I want people to know what a president's house looked like, right, in the late 18th century. This house would have to house the Washingtons, 2 of their grandchildren, 9 enslaved people, the number sort of ticks up when they come to Philadelphia, scores of secretaries, and scores of servants. So this house is packed. Ona lives in a space, she's still one of only 2 enslaved women with the Washingtons. And she lives in this space, and not only is this sort of space sort of tight, but she comes to Philadelphia and she realizes fairly quickly that she, as an enslaved person, is in the minority. That Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in particular, had already started to dismantle slavery. So when she arrives in Philly, she's one of maybe 100 enslaved people in the entire city. She's the oddball. There are over 6,000 free blacks. And so another thing that we get to see with Ona's travel from New York to Philadelphia to Pennsylvania is how different each of these former colonies, now states, were regarding slavery. And so when she arrives in Pennsylvania, there's clearly a different feel, in part because of a large Quaker presence, but the law had changed to start emancipation for black people. 1780, a law was passed. It said if you were born March 1st, 1780, as an enslaved person, you could only be held for 28 years. That's a long time, especially at this moment in life, right? That's half your life for the most part. But what it does is begin to dismantle slavery, right? So that by the time she arrives in 1790, 10 years after this bill, people are being set free. And this is an immediate problem for George Washington and Martha Washington. The Attorney General comes to visit. George is off on his southern tour, and Martha's at home, and he says, listen, we have a problem with this law. And the law was problematic for non-residents. So George Washington and Martha Washington came to live in Pennsylvania, but they were not residents. And the law stated that you could only come with an enslaved person for up to 6 months. And then after 6 months, if you didn't leave, your slave could be set free. Dun, 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 right? This is the moment where the Attorney General says, hey, you know, I lost some of my slaves, they found out about the law, they ran off. You may want to be careful about this. And so there are these letters that go back and forth between George Washington and his secretary, Tobias Lear. And this is the moment where the Washingtons really create what I call a sort of slave rotation plan. And they move their slaves every 6 months from Pennsylvania to Virginia. In essence, kind of restarting the clock on this residency rule. And if that was too much of a problem, they take a quick trip to Trenton, reset the clock, because they'd left the state and came back. You know, this is one of the moments in the archives where I was like, George, really? Like, gosh, geez. Okay, so you're not breaking the law, but you're clearly breaking the spirit, right, of the law. And at this point, you know, it becomes very clear that although they're in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia in particular, with a very small population of enslaved people, they were unwilling to live without slave labor, wherever they went. And Washington writes notes about, you know, because I said to myself, well, why not just use white servants like everybody else was doing, or even sort of black servants? But Washington wrote, he didn't want them. Complained about them, said they were lazy, said they were dirty, and all kinds of things, and he preferred his people. And so because of that, he used this kind of slave rotation plan in order to keep enslaved people with him in Philadelphia. And no matter what kind of rules they created or circumvented, what they couldn't prevent was Ona Judge and her enslaved companions from seeing black freedom around them. They saw black men and women as entrepreneurs in the streets, selling their fruits and vegetables, their oysters. They were building Mother Bethel Church around the corner, and what she saw play out in front of her was black freedom. And there was no way the Washingtons could prevent her from seeing that. The ledger books tell us that she went to the circus, she went to the theater. There were things she experienced as a Philadelphian that she never would have experienced in Virginia. And this is coming at a moment where she is coming of age, right? She's sort of what we would call a teenager now, moving into her early 20s, living this more cosmopolitan life in the North, surrounded by black freedom. It was a recipe for what would eventually happen to Ona's life later on. And so she lived in this space, and dramatic events in February of 1796 changed the course of her life. February 1796 brought a palpable unease to the executive mansion. A thick tension prompted Ona Judge and her enslaved companions to tread lightly around George and Martha Washington. Enslaved men and women always moved about their days with caution, not knowing what events could sour or sweeten an owner's mood. For slaves who resided within the same walls as their owner, life could be akin to walking through fields embedded with landmines. The smallest of matters, such as the accidental breaking of a dish or inconveniently timed bad weather, could alter the disposition of an owner. Although the president did not earn the reputation of being a violent or physically punishing slave owner, he did, on occasion, lose his temper, and he wrote back and forth to his estate manager about correcting difficult slaves. So here we are in February of 1796, and the mail arrives. And Ona watches a letter arrive on February 6th that kind of changes the household. She knew that Martha Washington really loved and kind of doted upon her grandchildren. And I think one of the things I try to do in the book is to show us the sort of very human problems that everybody faced, not simply Ona, but George Washington, Martha Washington as well. Martha Washington lived through some very sort of traumatic moments. She lost her first husband, and she would lose every one of her children, from infancy up to young adulthood. So that by the time George Washington becomes president, all of her children are gone. So she really has only her grandchildren to look to. And that's the reason that in February of 1796, things sort of went a little haywire. They received a letter from Eliza Parke Custis Law, who was one of Martha Washington's grandchildren. She actually remained, she was a little older, so she remained in Virginia, but the Washingtons would actually bring 2 grandchildren to live with them in New York and in Philadelphia because their father was gone. Eliza remained in Virginia, but still he was very close to she was very close to all of her grandchildren. So Eliza sends a letter in February of 1796, and it's met with great surprise. Another thing to note about the importance of grandchildren and children, George Washington and Martha Washington never had children together. George Washington had no biological children, at least none that we know of. So at this point, I'm going to go with that. He has no biological children. And so I think that also becomes important later on when we think about what George Washington does with his will and his and inheritance, issues around inheritance. But Eliza was sort of known for having this kind of stormy temper. This actually was an image that came from a portrait done by Gilbert Stuart, who lore has it that he was actually painting a picture of the president. Eliza came in, she burst through the doors, she had this kind of imposing form about her, and Gilbert Stuart was more interested in her and painted her picture instead. And I use this image because I think it gives us an idea about who she was as a person. She was a sort of volcanic, sometimes irritable woman. I also think in the 18th century, she kind of got a bad rap because she sort of knew what she wanted out of life and didn't really care about social sort of trappings or understanding. She would come to Philadelphia, she'd refuse to go to church, Martha would be like, oh, and George thought it was funny, and so she was, she was a woman who sort of marched to the beat of her own drum, and in February she sent home a letter that demonstrated this, and she said, I'm getting married, and you don't know this guy, and he's 20 years older than I am. His name is Thomas Law, and he's a British businessman who had come from England. He had come to America in 1794, so only a few years before. He was involved in land development in and around the federal city, and what was also really interesting about Thomas Law is that he had spent a significant amount of time in India, and he brought with him to America 2 of his 3 biracial children from an Indian woman. So, this was too much in many ways. So I'm reading through the letters of his vice president, John Adams, at the time, and he's totally gossiping about it with Abigail, which is hilarious. It's like TMZ of the 18th century. He's like, Betsy is getting married to this older man. He's got these swarthy children. And Martha's pretending to be happy about it. So I'm like laughing when I'm reading these letters because that's exactly what was happening, right? And Martha was very upset at first, eventually came to accept this. George Washington would write back to Eliza and to Thomas Law and would say, look, you know, this is what you want, okay, please, we don't want you to go to England, please stay here. That was one of their worries. And we bless you and come visit us in Philly, is basically what the letter said. But this news really would change Ona's life, and she had no idea at first how much it would. There were other things happening at this moment as well. The president had decided not to run for a third term in office. So the public didn't know, but the family did, which meant Ona knew, which also meant that the enslaved who lived in Philadelphia knew that they would be returning to Virginia fairly soon. And Ona knew and stated that she had lived in the North for 7 years, and the thought of returning to Mount Vernon did not settle well. All of these things culminated with the marriage of Eliza Custis in March of 1796. And Martha Washington's deep concern for her granddaughter trumped any relationship she may have forged with Judge, sensing that Eliza had entered into a marriage for which she was unprepared. The First Lady made a decision that would help her granddaughter navigate through this transition. She would give Ona Judge to Eliza. And so this is really the moment, one of the triggers that prompts Ona to think about escape. Eliza and Ona were similar in age, close in age, and she's very clear about her thoughts of living a life with Eliza Custis Law. She was sort of dead set against it. And I'm going to read a little bit from the book, just a moment, on this moment of Ona making a decision to escape. Judge knew what the future should hold should she not heed the advice of her free black associates. Quote, she supposed if she went back to Virginia, she should never have a chance to escape, end quote. Once she learned that upon the decease of her master and mistress, she would become the property of a granddaughter of theirs by the name of Custis, she knew that she had to flee. She imagined that her work for the laws would begin immediately, not after the death of her owners, prompting a fierce clarity about her future and dislike for Eliza Custis. Quote, she was determined never to be her slave, end quote. Her decision was made. She would risk everything to avoid the clutches of the new Mrs. Law. Judge was well informed and knew that her decision to flee was far more than risky. But still, she was willing to face dog-sniffing kidnappers and bounty hunters for the rest of her life. Yes, her fear was consuming, but so too was her anger. Judge could no longer stomach her enslavement, and it was the change in her ownership that pulled the trigger on Judge's fury. She had given everything to the Washingtons. For 12 years, she had served her mistress faithfully, and now she was to be discarded like the scraps of material that she cut from Martha Washington's dresses. Any false illusions she had clung to had evaporated, and Judge knew that no matter how obedient or loyal she may have appeared to her owners, she would never be considered fully human. Her fidelity meant nothing to the Washingtons. She was their property, to be sold, mortgaged, or traded with whomever they wished. Knowing this, Ona made the decision on May 21st, 1796, to run away from the Washingtons while they ate their supper, and she never returned. And this sort of brings us to where I started with this talk, which is, you probably can't see it, I'm sorry for that, but this is one of the fugitive slave ads, or ads that appeared in the newspaper when Ona ran off. So this is Claypool's American Daily Advertiser, and there was actually the one I saw was in the Philadelphia Gazette. And the Washingtons would advertise for her return for over a week in the newspaper, and then they stopped. And what I found so interesting in this, in the language of the newspaper, it described her absconded from the household of the President of the United States. On Saturday afternoon, Oni Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled with very black eyes and bushy black hair. She's of middle stature, but slender and delicately made, about 20 years of age. So this is really one of the only descriptions. We don't have an image of Ona, but we have a description of her. But what I thought was really interesting in the language was that it went on to say, as there was no suspicion of her going off, and it happened without the least provocation. It is not easy to conjecture whether she is gone fully or what her design is. And so this is the reminder that, you know, the Washingtons really fashioned themselves as benevolent slaveholders, right? That why would someone like Ona want to run off? She had nicer clothing, perhaps a bed to sleep in, right next to their room. You know, so what on earth could make them run off, make her run off? And for many years, Washington believed that it wasn't Ona's own design to run off, but that instead it was led by a crazy Frenchman. He blamed everything on this crazy Frenchman. I really believes this for years. He never believes that it's actually Ona's design to do this herself. And Ona tells us in her interviews later on that it's the free black men and women of Philadelphia who help her plan this escape. And this escape eventually brings her to Portsmouth. And so I know we might have some Portsmouth folks in the house and New Hampshire people in the house, and so I will leave a little bit of time for us to have questions and comments about the second part of the book, which is this title, After Never Caught, is The Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge. And what I will say is that she runs off in 1796. George Washington finds out where she is she runs in May, he knows by August where she is. And he would die in December of 1799, and for the rest of his life, he was pursuing her, using federal appointees to help, family members, customs collectors, all were pulled in to try and reclaim Ona Judge. And I think the fact that she was able to remain never caught speaks to not only her strength, but the community of white and black men and women in New England who helped her remain detached from the Washingtons. And while she lived a life nearly half a century long in hiding, I don't believe she ever wanted to be forgotten. And hopefully with this book, she now won't be forgotten. So thank you all. Questions about the book? Yes.
I'm from Greenfield, which is near Peterborough, and I heard that she lived for a while, or was for a while in Milford, which is real near where I live. Can you tell us about her time in Milford?
Yeah, so the question is about where she lives once she gets to New Hampshire. And what I was able to determine was that she actually spent a significant amount of time in Portsmouth till about 1804. And after that moment, she moves to Greenland. So she would spend the rest of her life in Greenland, which is, 6-7 miles outside of Portsmouth. And at that point was really sort of the forest, right? And she was there. I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about fugitives, that anonymity is the most important thing in your life, right? Not being detected. So being in the woods would actually facilitate her hiding. And she would eventually lean upon, once again, a free black community, a household of free blacks who would eventually take her in. So she spent most of her time in Greenland. And I've spent some time in Greenland to where we believe Ona's remains are, which is on private property. And what became very clear to me is, and this is in the 21st century, walking the land, was even right now I could see just how isolated and hidden she was. and how that became a necessity for her. She was always a fugitive. And according to the law, she belonged to the estate of Martha Washington's heirs. So after George Washington dies in 1799, he actually emancipates his enslaved men and women in his will after the death of Martha Washington. So that's what the will said, set my slaves free after Martha dies. So Martha realizes the only thing standing in between these people's freedom is her life, right? So that did not allow her to rest easy. And so she emancipates the Washington slaves early, right? There were some suspicious fires at Mount Vernon. She wrote she was nervous about it, so she just set them free. She never emancipated any of the enslaved men and women that were part of her estate. All of them would be willed off to her grandchildren later on. So that included Ona Judge. So even upon hearing the news of George Washington dying, and perhaps even hearing that he emancipated his slaves, that would not have affected Ona Judge. She still remained a part of the property, the inheritance of the grandchildren. And I tracked all of the enslaved who went to the different grandchildren just to see if they had Ona's name down. They didn't, but her siblings were there. Her siblings were sent out to different grandchildren. I don't want to ruin it because I want some of you to buy the book and read the book, but you know, I think this pursuit and how Ona sort of maneuvers, manages to remain, as I said before, never caught, is a testimony to her strength, but also this unique community in Greenland and Portsmouth, as well as sort of free blacks in Philadelphia, clearly, that she maneuvered in between.
Did she ever marry? I don't know if that's a spoiler alert, or the minimum playing clubs.
Yeah. So the question is, did she marry? I'm trying not to tell it all, but so yeah, she and I think, okay, so since you said that, let me just get one more slide up. So this is one of my aha moments in the archives is when I found her marriage announcement in the paper, and I thought, holy moly, this is in the New Hampshire Gazette, January of 1797. In this town, Mr. John Staines to Miss Oni Judge. And what I thought was remarkable, what was remarkable about this is, one, she's still using the name Oni, right? So this is only, what, 7, 8 months after she had run off. She didn't use a pseudonym. She probably didn't know that this was going to be printed in the paper. And what happened was you went to the county clerk, you signed your papers, you got married, and it was always announced in the paper. And it appeared clearly for everyone to see. She marries John, who's also called Jack Staines more frequently. He was a free black sailor. And so she marries a free black man, but that doesn't actually affect her life. She's still enslaved. And any children that they might have would also be enslaved because slavery followed the apron strings of its women. Didn't matter what your status was if you're of a father. Followed the women. So any children, I'm not giving it away, but if she had children, they would be considered fugitives as well. But what was so great about finding this notice in the paper was when you looked 2 columns over in the New Hampshire Gazette, George Washington was giving his final farewell to the citizens of New Hampshire. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so crazy. Like, he's saying goodbye and thank you, and here's Ona Judge kind of contesting him in print. And of course, she didn't know that, you know, it was going to come out on that day, but what a sort of incredible sight. But she does find love and family, and for 50 years, she lives a very difficult life. And so what the book also tries to do is to dismantle this myth that the North provided easy living for black people, enslaved, fugitive, or free. And that once she made it to the North, she was still stymied with the problems of poverty, of isolation, of really not having enough to eat many times. And so the other thing that this book does is help us to rethink and recast what the North meant to enslaved people and fugitives. I think we have time for one more. Yes?
Talk about the interviews and where you found those.
The interviews? Okay, so questions about the interviews. So there were 2 interviews that she gave towards the end of her life. And she felt comfortable enough at this point, one in, actually, can you hit the projector? It is one of them. One that appeared in the Granite Freeman in May of 1845, which was an abolitionist newspaper in New Hampshire, and her second interview appeared in the Liberator on New Year's Day in 1847. Ona died in 1848, so she kind of outlived everybody. She died in her mid-70s, and so she lived a long life. What I found sort of incredible about these interviews, which were clearly used in abolitionist newspapers to promote abolition. And so they're telling the story of, you know, an old enslaved woman who was held by the Washington. Yeah, she got her digs in the interviews, and explained her life and how it wasn't until in Portsmouth that she was able to sort of go to church and eventually become literate. I don't think she was able to write, but I believe she was able to read. But what was so incredible about this is in the next issue of the Granite Freeman, they're talking about this guy who's just written this book, this guy named Frederick Douglass, you know, and so what we're able to do really is to link Ona to this abolitionist movement that we have sort of in its sort of fiery moment in the 1840s. Would she have called herself an abolitionist? Probably not, right? However, I think it's so important that we link her to this movement because what she does by escape, she does decades before a Douglass or a Harriet Tubman. She does before the construction of an underground railroad, this kind of loose connection of safe houses. That's the 19th century. She ran away in the 18th century. And so and she was the president, you know, lived in the president's house. So I think that in so many ways she is emblematic of the fact that people were always trying to find freedom at every moment, every day, no matter who your owner was, no matter where you lived, freedom was always preferable. And these interviews sort of shed light on her escape and her life once she arrives in New England. So I think we're out of time, but thank you all.